Welcome to We Canada's YouTube channel. My name is Alexandra and we're currently reporting from Montreal. Today I'm here with one of my personal heroes, Désirée McGraw. She's known for a couple of tours she did across Canada 20 and 25 years ago, and one of those tours was right before the Earth Summit 1992. Désirée McGraw is also one of the founders of Al Gore's Climate Reality Project, and she's been named a global youth leader by the World Economic Forum. Hi Désirée, thanks for meeting you here with us today.
Pleasure.
Well, as I mentioned, you became known in your teens for doing these amazing tours across the country. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about your experience?
Sure. I got involved in global issues really when I was a teenager. It was during the Cold War, so it was the mid-'80s, so you have to imagine a different time, and studies were showing that 1 in 4 Canadian youth were having nightmares about nuclear war, and 1 in 5 were not planning on getting married or having children because of the threat of nuclear war. So a group of high school students, the group called SAGE, Students Against Global Extermination, or Solidarité Anti-Guerre Étudiante, decided to take the presentations we were doing in Montreal high schools to our peers across the country, because we started getting invitations. To make a long story short, we took a year off school and traveled from Newfoundland to British Columbia and then on to the US and the former Soviet Union. We ended up speaking in 1 in 8 high schools in Canada about the threat of nuclear war and what young people could do about it. Following that tour, of course, I went back to school and had co-hosted a video series with David Suzuki called Alive in the Nuclear Age, and then through that involvement got involved in environmental issues, as a lot of peace activists from the 80s then transitioned into environmental issues. That's really how I got involved in environmental issues a few years later. And again, another long story short, we created another national tour, but this time on the environment, called Student Action for a Viable Environment, or Solidarité Action Unie vers l'Environnement, SAVE or SOVE. At that point, I think I was 19, we felt we were too old to speak to high school students because it's important to have the peer-to-peer approach. Mm-hmm. So we selected 10 young people from across Canada to go. And from there, I went on to get involved in the Earth Summit in Rio. So that was sort of the background.
Sounds pretty incredible. So here we are 20 years later. Do you think anything has changed? And if so, what has changed? What's your view on the situation, world situation, but also the situation in Canada?
Well, I think it's important to just go back 20 years ago to Rio and try to put ourselves in the mindset of what was happening, and sort of then you can compare and contrast where we are today. So I took another year off school in the lead up to Rio. I was one of 2 global youth ambassadors named by Maurice Strong. So here's the first difference. Maurice Strong is a Canadian diplomat and businessman who chaired the Earth Summit, which was also the UN Conference on Environment and Development. And at that time we were real leaders. We were leaders both because we were chairing the summit, or a Canadian was chairing the summit, but our government was a leader. We were one of the first industrialized countries to sign and ratify the biodiversity and climate change conventions. So we were really out there. Also, the composition of our delegation, it was a real multi-stakeholder approach. It was government and business and NGOs and youth and women and Aboriginal representation as well. And so you compare and contrast that today. I always say we went from leaders in the early 90s to sort of laggards throughout the rest of the 90s and into the 2000s to laughing stocks, and really now obstructionists, where we're actually, overtly standing in the way of making progress. So it's been an incredible change in 20 years, both because the problems are getting more serious, but instead of reacting to that in a positive way, we're actually reacting in a negative way. So the gap between problem and solution is growing. So it's discouraging, I guess. And there was at the time we were very proud to be part of the Canadian delegation. Now, look, in Rio, they were general framework agreements. It's pretty easy to sign on when you have general statements of principle. And since Rio, things have become more difficult with the Kyoto Protocol and other sub-agreements to these larger agreements in Rio. Climate change, biodiversity, all spawned these sub-agreements or protocols. And of course that does become, they're legally binding, they're much more precise. It is harder to implement them. So part of what we're seeing is just that countries are grappling. There's some genuine good faith grappling, but there's some not good faith, I think, in terms of not really making any honest efforts to meet our targets, particularly in climate change. And I think that's been a real change. Whereas Canada led under a previous Conservative government, led the world really on these issues. We now have a very different situation. And what concerns me, it's not about playing politics, is bottom line is we're not addressing climate change. That's the problem. Is you can have all the politics in the world, the science doesn't change, the chemistry of the atmosphere doesn't change, greenhouse gases are increasing, we're changing the weather, and that's a serious concern for anyone who cares about the future of the planet.
Yes, sadly, but true, most of the things you addressed. Here we are, We Canada has been trying to inspire civil society and to, even despite all these flops we have seen in the last few years, a lot of youth are very hopeful that the Earth Summit can be that one spot where real change can be achieved. And you became one of the champions of We Canada. Thank you. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what motivated you. And
I'm actually quite an optimistic person in general. We're just following now on the heels of this Durban debacle, so I'm a little less optimistic today. But in general, I like to call myself a practical idealist. So I have, we all have our ideals, but I try to be quite practical about how we get there. And normally I am an optimist. And I think you have to be an optimist in this business, and you also have a responsibility to at least be, even if you're intellectually pessimistic, right? Because if you look at the facts and figures, there's reason for pessimism, but you have to be operationally optimistic. That is, optimistic in your actions, and act as if there is hope, and that hopefully will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So We Canada to me is about operational optimism. It's about being positive towards the future and taking real action to make sure that we get there. And so I do believe, I think we need to take all the positive measures that we can to inspire people to take action. And so I actually, I've been talking a little bit about the Canadian government, how our position has shifted. Our government obviously is the face of Canada at these international negotiations. But in terms of where average Canadians stand on these issues, there's a real disconnect between where Canadians stand and our federal government in particular, because poll after poll shows that Canadians do care about these issues, would be willing to pay a certain price to make these changes, and want to see our economy grow through green stimulus, so that Canadians understand that economics and the environment are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And unfortunately, you have a dialogue right now, a national dialogue that's very old school. I feel like we're going back before Rio, when people used to oppose the environment and economic development, when in fact you can have that's the whole point. Rio made sustainable development mainstream. And I remember the debates in Rio. At first it was north versus south, environment versus development, and the whole beauty of Rio and its real strength was trying to integrate these two and recognize that they can be accommodated. Not necessarily at once. There was recognition that industrialized countries were mainly responsible through our consumption and production for many of the environmental problems we're seeing, notably global warming, and therefore they had to take the first steps to making a difference, since we're disproportionately responsible for the problems we see. So there was this pact, there's this pact in Rio, and now I feel like we're actually going back, not just 20 years, but before Rio, and we're really regressing. And so I hope that Canadians are informed enough and inspired enough to understand that that's just old rhetoric. It doesn't really apply anymore. So I think part of the role of We Canada is that education through the schools, through the tours, getting people to write letters to their elected representatives to, you don't have to be an expert. I think you just need to know that there are some environmental problems, and that we need the political will to address these problems. It can keep it, quite simple. I know for every letter that a member of parliament receives, they know that represents at least 20 other people who feel the same way but didn't write the letter. So each letter, particularly if it's not a form letter, does make a difference.
That's really good to hear, because sometimes I feel, even myself, even when we sign that letter, it really doesn't feel like we're making difference.
Right.
But it's been a really great reminder for me to read that the abolition movement also involved letter writing campaigns hundreds of years ago. And We Canada does have part of its campaign that's focused on letter writing. So, as you said,
I mean, we have a lot more at our disposal today than when I was a teenager on the stage tour. We talked about letter writing. We have social media. There are many more tools at the disposal of young people. I would just say, though, I used to work in a minister's office as a senior policy advisor, and in the federal cabinet, and one of my jobs, among many, was to get letters. And I'm telling you, these letters actually make a difference, especially when you have enough of them, because there's a multiplier effect. The minister has to be aware that this is so not just MPs but ministers and the Prime Minister's office as well. So I think that's just one of the many tools, and of course young people are dynamic and creative, and I'm sure they can come up with other means beyond the sort of the old-fashioned letter. There is something to be said, however, for just a good old-fashioned handwritten letter. In some ways it has more novelty today because everything's done electronically. So it's one of the things in the toolkit that we need to do. But I think the bottom line is we need to put pressure, because what's missing in all of this is that you have action at the different provincial levels and to some extent municipal, but it's like this patchwork approach. There's no clear, comprehensive approach at the national level, and so it's inefficient actually, and it's not sending the right signals to industry to make longer term decisions, investment and other decisions. So we really need a national approach to these issues, and that's really what's been missing. That's where the leadership has been missing, and it's not just one particular government. All governments, including governments that I've worked in, have to take some of the blame, because the bottom line is, look at where we are today in terms of biodiversity loss. Look at where we are today in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions. The reality is we're going in the wrong direction. So that's the bottom line. It's not the intentions of government or what statements they made in a particular speech. It's the action and the impact. And right now, we're going the wrong way, so we really need to turn that around.
Especially looking at what happened yesterday and the days before at COP17. So if we had a way to take you to Rio, would you consider coming?
Well, no, I think Rio's going to be, to be honest, I think Rio plus 20 becomes more important than ever. So I think part of what happened in Rio is you had these agreements, and then you had a decade of the 1990s of UN-sponsored summits on social development, on habitat, on a whole bunch of issues. And I think kind of the world had sort of conference fatigue. And then each of these conferences spurred sub-agreements. And there have been all these conferences, and we sort of have a name for these people who go to all these conferences called, the super delegates. And I used to work as a reporter for the UN. I used to cover these for a living when I was in graduate school. To pay for my graduate studies, I worked as a reporter covering these negotiations. So what I see in Durban is, they've looked for some kind of last-minute face-saving strategy, but really we've come very close to failing, and if not real failure. And in some ways, as Maurice Strong said at the Earth Summit, if we're going to fail, let's fail big, so citizens of the world understand what's really happened here and can put pressure on their governments. I think that the danger with Durban is that there was this last-minute strategy to sort of cobble together some kind of agreement through to 2020, and it's going to lull people. My concern is going to lull people into a false sense of security. Why? Because these issues are huge, and people don't want to believe they're happening. So anything that can make someone feel like, okay, our governments are taking care of it, I can go on with my life, right? Because it's an inconvenient truth. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to believe it. It's hard, it's a hard reality to grapple with. So we're all looking for an out. We're all looking for a way out. And what worries me about Durban is it's sort of an easy way out. So I think Rio becomes that much more important in terms of allowing people to come together, not just governments, but citizens to come together and look comprehensively at these issues, not just climate change, biodiversity, desertification, how all of these issues come together. I hope that between Durban and Rio, that there's enough of a sense of urgency, and I hope that's part of what we do with We Canada, a sense of urgency around these issues, that we've been talking about these issues since the 80s, the 70s, and we keep talking about talks and agreements and sub-agreements, but the raw data, the facts haven't changed, they're getting worse. So my concern is that these conferences become talk shops and lull people into a false sense of security, and what we really need to do is infuse people with a sense of reality and action. So I hope that's what I see in We Canada, and I'll do my part along those lines.
So as a We Canada champion, what would be your message to Canadians?
My message to Canadians would be to stay smart, to stay focused on the real facts, to not be swayed by propaganda, to understand the real issues, and to behave as if there's hope, and because there is always hope, and to take action in your own way. So both at the personal level, we need to take responsibility in our own lives, but it's, as I like to say, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. There also needs to be action at the macro level, because the macro government policy is what sets or shapes decisions by investors, by corporations, by communities. And so we need to put pressure on our elected officials at every level, municipal, provincial, federal, so that nobody's getting elected or nobody is serving in office without having a serious position and plan on sustainable development. We're just well past the point where this is just some cute catchword. This is the way of the future, and we've got to get on with it. So I guess it's information and awareness armed with action and being smart and focused about it. Yeah.
Dialogue and action. Désirée, thank you so much for making the time for us today. We hope that we'll collaborate further in We Canada. I know we have the Cross Canada Tour coming up. Thank you so much for your support. And thank you so much for spending the time with us. We will see you next time. This is Alexandra for We Canada from Montreal.